What are earnouts? How do they work? And how do they affect the buyers or sellers? I'm Malcolm Zoppi, an English qualified solicitor, and in this video, we'll discuss earnouts in the context of M&As, mergers and acquisitions. We'll go over three main things. Number one, what are earnouts and how do they work? Second, earnouts from the perspective of the buyer. And lastly, earnouts from the perspective of the seller. Fantastic, let's get started. So chapter 1 is what are earnouts? An earnout is a contractual provision in the share purchase agreement, so the main contract between the buyer and the seller of a business, which states that part of the purchase price is only payable by the buyer to the seller if the target business meets specific financial targets. So rather than, for example, paying the entire purchase price on completion, part of the purchase price is payable later, let's say over a period of 2 years, and payment over those 2 years are contingent on the target business, again, meeting specific financial targets, typically based on profit levels. So the main reason why earnouts are typically used is because they try to bridge a valuation gap that exists between what the buyer values a business as and what the seller values their business as. So typically a seller would value their business higher than a buyer is willing to pay for that business, and therefore an earnout is a great way to bridge that gap. So the difference between what a buyer is prepared to pay for that business and what the seller wants. So that gap can be as an earnout. Now let's delve deeper into the advantages and disadvantages for the buyer and then for the seller. Chapter 2 is advantages and disadvantages of earnouts for buyers. So the advantages for a buyer, number one, is that they pay less money upfront and therefore are risking less money. So second, better cash flow management. So the deferred payments will need to be financed typically by the target business. And if we make the deferred payments contingent on the target business meeting specific financial targets, then it eases the pressure on cash flow management, because if the business can pay, then it will pay. If it can't, then it won't. And lastly, it helps to keep the seller motivated. So especially if you as a buyer are planning on keeping the seller in the business during the earnout period, then the seller is very much motivated to want the business to do well. They will not want to slack or try and move clients around, because they'll want the business to do well so that they get paid those additional sums. But there are also disadvantages. So the first thing is administrative burdens. So earnouts add complexity to the deal, add complexity to the negotiations, and it also requires more documentation to be produced to evidence, for example, the mechanism or the calculations that have been made to determine whether an earnout payment is owed to the seller or not. So that can also increase professional fees. Second, typically, the seller will want to include in the share purchase agreement restrictions on what the buyer can do with the business once they bought it during that earnout period. And that is to avoid the buyer conducting activities that would result in the seller not getting the earnout money. So that means that the buyer is going to be restricted on what they can do during that earnout period. And lastly, disputes are going to be more likely when it comes to earnouts. And that's because, number one, the calculations might be disputed, but that can also be the case, for example, when it comes to completion accounts. But the second big thing that can lead to disputes is the activities of the buyer and the company during the earnout period. So it's not unlikely or so uncommon for a seller to not be happy with the things that the buyer is doing with the target business during the earnout period, because sometimes they will affect whether the seller is going to get paid the money or not. So for example, if some of the targets are profit level targets, but the buyer is reinvesting heavily into the business and therefore incurring a lot of costs, which bring down profit level, then that might be good for the buyer in the long term because the business is going to grow more over the long term. But in the short term, that has an impact on profits and therefore on the trigger events of the seller getting those earnout payments. So my big tip is for buyers to clarify exactly how those earnouts are to be calculated, and you'll want to discuss with your team internally what your plans are when you take over that business, to make sure that this seller doesn't include any provisions that restrict you from fulfilling those plans. Now, before we discuss earnouts for the sellers, feel free to email me if looking for professional legal advice. With my legal advice calls, there are no charges, no obligations, and no nonsense. Contact me now at info@zoppi.co.uk. Fantastic. Moving on to the last chapter, which is earnouts for the sellers. What are the advantages and disadvantages of earnouts from the perspective of a seller? The first big advantage for a seller is a higher valuation. So there is an opportunity, a chance that the seller gets paid more money than the buyer was initially prepared to pay for that business. Second, the seller might actually retain more control over the target business during the earnout period, as opposed to simply having a fixed amount that payable over a period of time. Because typically in M&As, in mergers and acquisitions, it's very unlikely that the entire purchase price is payable on completion. So it's very likely that at least a part of the purchase price is always paid over a period of time. Now, if you do it as a normal deferred payment that's not an earnout, it's very unlikely that the seller is going to have a say on how that business is run after they sold it to the buyer. Instead, when it comes to earnouts, it's quite acceptable for the seller to introduce restrictions on what the buyer can do during that time, and therefore the seller during the earnout period has more control over the profitability and performance of the sold business, therefore is more likely maybe to get paid in any case. And lastly, although I'm not a tax advisor, there might be tax planning opportunities that the seller may have by receiving money over a period of time, and therefore the seller might want to speak with their tax advisor about that aspect. Let's move on to the disadvantages of earnouts for sellers. First, earnouts are less certain. So you're not guaranteed, nothing is ever really guaranteed, but you're not guaranteed that you'll get to those payments. As we know, as is the nature of an earnout, are only going to be payable if the business meets those financial targets. And sometimes meeting financial targets is not entirely within the control of the buyer, the seller, or the company. There might be influences that come from outside, for example, the economy overall, government policies that are brought in place. Secondly, if you compare earnout payments to completion payments, or money that the seller would receive on completion, the seller has less control over those payments. So it's less likely to receive those payments. And lastly, again, as with the buyer, disputes are more likely to arise. It's more likely that you as a seller are going to be unhappy with the things that the buyer is doing with the business that you sold, because you have more of a vested interest. You don't really guarantee those amounts to be paid to you. Those amounts are only going to be paid to you again if the business does well, and you might be scrutinizing the buyer more for their actions compared to what you would be doing if you wanted the business to do well. Accordingly, my pro tip for the seller is to, as mentioned before or suggested too many times, include restrictions in the share purchase agreement as to what the buyer is allowed to do during the earnout period with the company. One of the main things you might want to consider stopping the buyer from doing is, for example, taking out huge loans or declaring profits and so on. If you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning about the different mechanisms outside of earnouts that allow buyers and sellers to adjust the purchase price in a business acquisition, make sure to watch this video right here to learn about the purchase price adjustments. Thank you for watching.